Hey everyone, Ben here. If that's your first time around, I'm especially happy to have you tuned in. If you're a frequent listener, thank you so much. I'm glad you like the content, and the second best thing you can do to help this project grow is to enjoy all the episodes we put out. And the very best you can do to support this podcast is to give it 5 stars on your player and leave us a review on Apple Podcast. That would be a banger. But now to today's guest. I'm having David Anderson with me. As David is one of the most influential management experts out there, I was especially curious in his career at Corbis and Microsoft, and how he came up with all the management practices that influence thousands around the world. But enough of the teasing, let's start. David, welcome to the show. It's so great having you here.
Welcome. No. Can we start again?
I'm keeping this one. This is going to be great. Hey David, welcome to the show.
Hi Benjamin, thank you for having me. It's great to see you again.
Likewise. It's really been a while. I wish we could have met in Portugal, but I was busy with building all of this here. It's so cool having you here because I feel that the Agile community really is going sideways and we would need a different approach to achieve agility. So that's why I'm especially happy to have you as a guest on today's episode.
Thank you.
I think that many people already know you, have heard your name, know about Kanban, but for everyone new to the podcast, new to the topic, could you give us a brief introduction of who you are?
Okay, so I'm David Anderson and I'm from Scotland originally. I grew up on the west coast near Glasgow. My family's from Glasgow. I went to university in Glasgow where I studied electronics and software engineering degree really. And I specialised in control system engineering. And I was accepted to do a PhD in wind turbine design. Then the government pulled the funding from the research because they didn't think that was important back in 1991.
Did they call you again?
So I went to get a job, and prior to university, I'd been in the games industry. I was a programmer in the very early, during the 80s in the games industry. And therefore, I was already quite a seasoned, experienced developer who'd put out 22 products by the time that I graduated university. So I became the manager at a startup. It was a 5-year-old startup company that was beginning to scale up. But it was the early 90s. The world wasn't as global as it is today. There was no internet in the way that we know it. There was no World Wide Web. None of that stuff existed. So the market was a lot more regional. The UK was a regional market. Europe was a regional market. And places like the United States, they were terribly far away. So even the computers that people used back then were different. There were European companies making computers, and we would use those European-made computers. And Americans had different machines altogether, so the software wasn't even compatible. So it was a whole different era, but I started in management in 1991 when I graduated university. So I worked at small companies through the early 90s. And after the struggle of working in small companies and trying to raise venture capital funding in the early 90s in the UK, which it was a whole different world back then. Venture capital companies thought they were like charities that were giving you money, and that they didn't want to give it to you because obviously you're a total loser. If you were any good at anything, you'd be working at a big company earning a decent salary. Why are you having to beg for money So I came out of that, and I got a contract job at IBM for a couple of years, and I worked on BIOS code for PC servers, and I worked on some back-end stuff for the PC company's online presence, which all ran in Lotus Notes. So you could go to the website pc.ibm.com to buy a PC, but the back end of that was all Lotus Notes. And behind that was a whole bunch of mainframes. And I wrote code, for example, that figured out when you were configuring your PC and it was calculating the price, based on the country you were in, it had to display the price in the right currency with the right currency symbol and whether it was on the front or the back. Right? That's the sort of stuff I was doing for a while at IBM. And then inside IBM, online forums, again, before the internet existed, but not really in the social media sort of way. So internal to the company, I got introduced to an ex-IBMer who was running a big project in Singapore, and he needed certain specialist skills. And I was one of the few people inside IBM, and I'm talking at a global level inside IBM, who was known to have these skills. So I was introduced to him and he said, "Hey, do you want to come work for me in Singapore for a couple of years?" And I thought that was quite an exciting opportunity. I was pretty young still. So I said yes, and I went off to do that. And that's how I ended up in the Agile movement, because one of the other consultants on that project was Peter Code, who had written 6 different books on object-oriented analysis and design. And he was one of the people who was credited with having a lightweight method. So Pete was actually invited to the Snowbird event that founded the Agile movement, but he didn't go. He delegated it to one of his staff, a guy called John Kern. So John is listed as one of the authors of the Agile Manifesto. Pete didn't show up. Pete wasn't the only guy who didn't show up. I know several who got guys who've been keynote speakers at our conferences over the years that didn't attend that event. So that's how I ended up in the Agile movement. And coming out of Singapore, I was briefly in Ireland, but that was because I had a job in the United States, but the company messed up the visa application and I had to wait another year for the visa. So I moved to the United States right at the point when George W. Bush was elected. So just as Bill Clinton was ending his term as the president. That's about very late 1999. And then I worked in big corporate America for a while, Motorola and Microsoft, Sprint. So I've worked at IBM, Motorola's mobile phone division, Sprint, which is a big telephone company, and Microsoft. And then right at the end of that, I worked for Bill Gates' smaller company called Corbis as the head of the software engineering group. Then I started my own business, 2008, still here.
Which was your first business? Like, what was the name of that back then? Can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Okay, yeah. My question was, what was the name of the first business you started?
The first business I started when I was 14 years old.
No, you started a business at 14?
Yeah.
What are you doing?
As a games programmer. Since 1981, really, I was making money from publishing computer games. In 81, it was pocket money. By 83, it was enough to buy some decent equipment. And by 1984, it was enough to walk into a BMW dealer and pay cash for a brand new car and just drive it away. So I was 17 years and 363 days old, and I paid cash for a brand new BMW and drove it out of the dealership.
That is pretty impressive. Being 17, I attended music festivals and slept in tents.
I'm sure that was more fun, Benjamin.
I wish I could tell you stories, but I actually don't quite remember everything that happened back then.
Sounds like a successful music
festival. Oh yeah, definitely. What happened after Microsoft? What happened after that?
So while I was at the end of that period at Microsoft, I was looking for a new job internally at the company because the job they'd hired me for had pretty much finished it. And at the time, they had me visiting clients, basically, customers in different industries, in different sectors where they were trying to grow their business. So I'd been to visit the IT department of Collier County, Florida, because they were trying to grow the public sector business, and particularly like at the county and the state level, or whatever the equivalent of that would be in different countries. And I'd also been to visit this Corbis company that Bill Gates owned in Seattle that mostly did stock photography, picture licensing, mostly, but not exclusively. And while I was visiting them, they were going through some managerial changes. A new CIO was coming in, and they needed someone to really fix their IT project delivery, IT systems upgrading, and the whole, well, most of the business ran on systems. The digital asset management system was the key thing for making money. Right? Someone comes to the website, wants to buy the license for an image. Well, the digital asset management system would be managing that. So some of it was the company's like customer-facing product, and some of the stuff was just back office things like payroll. They needed someone to fix that. Internally, it was badly broken. I think they suffered from an issue that we see in a lot of cities where there's a very rich, dominant tech company, or more than one. Because if you've got 2 or 3 rich, dominant tech companies, they can afford to pay really high salaries for top people. And they have very rigorous interview processes, and they can select the best candidates from the best universities with the best experience, the highest IQ, etc., etc. Well, if you're not that company and you're in that same city, that same labor pool market, you're getting kind of second or third tier people. And you do that for 15 years and you end up with a bunch of IT systems that are a bit crap. They don't work maybe as well as they could. So they needed someone to fix that, and they approached me about leaving Microsoft and joining them. And I looked at the org charts and I thought, between me and Bill, Microsoft, 13 layers. Between me and Bill at Corbis, 1 layer. I just thought it was a wonderful opportunity to really implement a lot of my ideas and things that I'd been blogging about, writing in my first book. And it worked really well. And then I went off to do it on my own, like, to spread it, to scale it out across the world in other companies. That if you just do it as a middle manager, you move from one company to another, you fix one at a time. But if you can somehow spread the word and build a network of followers who are using the technique, then you hit thousands, tens of thousands of companies and affect a lot more lives. But that was in its own way a different challenge. I was 39 years old, I think. I hadn't quite turned 40. And it was like being 16 again. It was like back to my entrepreneurial days of the games industry, but with a different product this time, with the essentially the Kanban product, although we didn't really start selling it that way for a couple more years. In 2008, we were still talking about agile management.
But now many people already know about Kanban. And I think you did an amazing job at bringing all of this knowledge to the world, and also your experience. For those of us who don't really know what Kanban is, or have maybe a misconception, I'd like to start this episode a little bit on the basics. So it would be cool to have your take on what Kanban is here on the podcast. So
right,
maybe you can start from the ground up and explain what Kanban is for everyone out there who maybe thinks it's just stickies on a board. So, or it's a drop-down menu in Jira.
Of course, after all these years, I have more insight into how to explain it. And nowadays, we break the general concepts or practices you have to follow into 2 groups: the operational practices and the management practices. And historically, we can look back at the evolution of how Kanban as a method for knowledge worker activities and originally just specialized in IT. We can look at the evolution of that, and the first implementation was with a team at Microsoft managed by a guy called Dragos Dimitriou, and I worked at Microsoft at the time. But I'd only just arrived there, I hadn't been there very long, and there was some internal forum discussing Agile methods, and I joined that, and I would comment from time to time. And Dragos had taken a job in the IT group, and he was researching what the hell is this Agile thing, and he'd bought my book, Agile Management. Oh, that's all very well, right? He saw me post one day on the internal forum, and he thought, wow, what a coincidence, this is David Anderson. So he called me up on the phone, right? The phone rang my desk, and I answered, and he said, hey, I saw your post on the online forum, and you seem like a pretty knowledgeable guy, and I've taken over this department. It's in a terrible mess. Can you help me? And he said, it's a really strange coincidence, but I'm reading this book right now called Agile Management by David Anderson. And I said to him, yes, I am David Anderson. And he said, yeah, I know that. What a coincidence that there's a book written by a guy with the same name. And I said, no, I'm David Anderson. And he said, yeah, I get that. But, it's just an amazing coincidence because the back of the book said I worked at Motorola. So I went to visit Dragos in his office, and he sketched a little stickman diagram of the workflow in his department, which was actually mostly in India. They were remote guys working in an office in Hyderabad. And we got started with the basic principles of we need to defer commitment until you're really sure that you're going to do something. And then when you commit, you have to deliver it immediately. And so we want to visualize the workflow. They had it in a tracking system already called Product Studio, which is an internal version of what Microsoft called Team Foundation Server, and now they call it Azure DevOps. So they had the data in Product Studio, but they weren't visualizing it in any way. So we start visualizing the data with metrics like a cumulative flow diagram. There was no Kanban board. We're just visualizing the flow from the tool. Then we limit the work in progress and we manage the flow. We actively manage the work changing from one state to another as we could see it in Product Studio. And that had a really dramatic effect over a 15 to 18 month period. We more than trebled the productivity of that department. We reduced their delivery times by, I think, 91 or 92% on average, and their on-time delivery from 0%, that's how bad they were, to 98% on time. Dragos got promoted, and then when the head of his business unit, the general manager, a guy called Dale Christian, he moved over to the Accenture joint venture company Avanade as the CIO, and he brought Dragos with him and made him the head of global IT for Avanade, the head of IT operations. So Dragos got one immediate promotion and then like a massive promotion as a consequence of it. So that was the basic mechanics, just implementing policies to help workflow. That how did you visualize, you limit the WIP, you manage the flow proactively.
How did you come up with all of the ideas of how to use this in knowledge work? Like, what was your source that you've been taking this from?
Yeah, so the original epiphany was a synthesis of some things that I'd been involved in the project in Singapore with Peter Code and the manager there, Jeff DeLuca. And together that group, the management team of that project had developed a new version of Pete's methodology. And that became known as feature-driven development. And it had a lot of the basics of tracking the states, using graphs to visualize where things were and how work was being finished, doing things in small batches and tracking the time, so that small batch of things was finished quickly. So the fundamentals of mapping the flow and visualizing it with metrics, that was there. There was no limiting whip at that point. Then, while I was in Singapore, I purchased a book. I was in the bookshop and there was a stack of them. I thought, this is interesting. Managing the Design Factory by Donald G. Reinertsen. So I had those, and then it's after I'd left Singapore, but I don't know exactly when. Maybe 2001, 2000 maybe still. My boss at Sprint handed out copies of The Goal by Ellie Goldratt to all of his leadership team. And it coincided with me taking a vacation to Japan. So I read the book on the flight. And then I had some epiphanies. And then I was on holiday with my family, my Japanese wife and all my in-laws and so on. So I didn't do anything for a while. I was in Japanese spas in the mountains, and chilled out. But when it came time to fly back, I was flying back on my own. I think my wife was staying longer. So I got a notebook, and all these ideas that had come from the combination of Reinertsen's work, the feature-driven development, and the theory of constraints and the goal, because I'd realized you could treat the feature and the state it was in as like a piece of inventory that was flowing through a physical environment. It's just it's not a physical environment. It's an intangible environment. If I synthesized that together and I sketched in the notebook a set of basically PowerPoint slides, and altogether it was 30, 36 maybe, in this notebook. Great. I was back at the office in Sprint, and for some completely separate reason, Peter Code was visiting Sprint. And he knew that I was there, so he just came over to visit me to hang out for a lunch or something. And I showed him the notebook and these ideas that I'd had, that I'd sort of taken away from Singapore and the feature-driven development method, that originally appeared as a chapter in his 6th book. And then my friend Steve Palmer and Mac Felsing wrote the whole book on the topic later. So I showed that to Pete, and I showed the influences of these other things. And he's like, wow, you need to do a book on this. I'm like, don't be silly, Pete. This is like 36 PowerPoint slides. It's not even in PowerPoint yet. He said, no, you can do a book on this. I will tell the publisher to give you a contract. And that became the Agile Management book. Although the publisher, and they do this with new authors all the time, so caution if a new author, and the publisher will always try to push you to extend the scope of the manuscript. And they will ask you to put stuff in there that is a thought experiment, things you haven't done, you haven't tried. And I took that bait, so I deeply regret. There are sections of the Agile Management book. It's a few chapters. It's not the whole book, but there are a few chapters of basically shit that I made up. It seemed like a good idea at the time. And the publisher, the editor, had pushed me into it. And I learned that lesson that I would never do it again, right? So when it came time to do the Kanban book, quite a few years, 7 years later, the Kanban book could only be about that I'd actually done, that I'd witnessed, that things we'd really tried. It had to be evidence-based in its entirety and no thought experiments, right? And it also became the core value for our business, the idea that we offer pragmatic, actionable, evidence-based guidance. If we haven't done it and tried it and proved that it works, we're not selling it to you.
Help me out on this one, because I think that the agile practices, like what you described and what you teach in your courses, as those are very hands-on, practical management practices that deliver results. But somehow, the agile movement differed from those type of things and moved into like roles, processes, events, descriptions on how events should be held, right? And I wonder where on this journey we sometimes I feel we lost touch a little bit to those general good management practices. I was in preparation of this episode, I was talking to my colleague Wolfgang, and he said, well, you could like put all the framework and all the titles away from the Kanban book, and it would be just like the one of the best summaries of management practices that you could get your hands on. But somehow things tend to evolve in a they, things need a name, and then people ask
Yeah,
for it, and then you get
absolutely.
processes, and then you get roles, and it differs from where it originally
The-
came from.
A name sort of provides a handle for a bag or a bucket of stuff that people can carry around. It's a container, really. And I found towards the end of the thousands that unless I labeled what I was doing Kanban, then people couldn't get their head around it. They needed some way of carrying around a set of concepts. So the label defines the container. Your question is a good segue back to the previous question. The second half, the management practices and the Kanban method, that came about from while I was working at Sprint, and I got the call to the corner office. My vice president said, David, I had guys in my office here 3-4 months ago telling me that you were a complete idiot and that you were going to get us all killed, that you had promised delivery of things on timescales that were impossible, and that I and the whole business unit would be left with egg on my face. And yet here we are, and you've delivered them all. What the hell are you doing upstairs? So I explained it to him, which was basically feature-driven development. And he said, wow, this is fabulous. Can you just get all your colleagues down the corridor to get their departments to do the same thing? So I took one of the guys in my department. He was a really good guy. He was one of the older guys on the staff, but he wasn't the sharpest programmer. But he had an enthusiasm for software engineering methodologies. I asked him if he would become the advisor to the other departments, and their managers supported the initiative because the vice president had told them to, right? So his job was to go and help these other 3 departments adopt our way of working. Nowadays, we'd call him an Agile coach, right? So he went off to do that. The managers were supportive, and they were all friends of mine. We'd sit around the same, leadership team tables at meetings regularly, multiple times a week. The adoption in these other teams was quite lackluster. It wasn't nearly as good as the adoption in my own department. When I say team, I'm talking like 30, 35 people in each case, right? We're dealing at a scale of 120 to 150 developers here already. And this is 2001. So what I saw there was that there was resistance, and the resistance took the nature of, that's all very well for you guys down the corridor, but our circumstances are completely different. So we'll take some of what you're doing, but we won't do all of it. We'll modify it. Well, now I was looking at this and saying, how different can it be? They're all developing software for the same website, using the same programming language in the same environment with the same shared services like DBAs and UX design, the same IT operations group, etc., etc. There was 1 or 2 little technology differences. The e-commerce group used a platform called Blue Martini. Most of the stuff ran on WebLogic that Blue Martini ran on, but there were subtle differences. But from a technology perspective, it was pretty much the same software engineering, but there was resistance. I was struggling to overcome this resistance from these other departments. My own team were following my lead, but the leadership, reflecting later, the leadership wasn't strong enough in the other groups. Well, I put that down to experience, and still we had a good impact. Although the adoption was lackluster, the other groups weren't going maybe as fast as my department was, but they were faster than they used to be. They were much more predictable and the quality was higher. So it was good. It was a good outcome and probably the elite programming group in the whole company, the whole of Sprint. So it wasn't a terrible outcome. I went to Motorola and within 2 years later, I saw the same pattern. The people that reported to me directly were really doing it properly, and other groups were resisting with that's all very well for you, but our situation is different. It won't work here. And I thought, okay, I'm beginning to think that this is core to the human condition. We can't point at these people and blame them for it. This is them being human. And therefore, any time you come along with a prescription, a defined software engineering methodology, any agile method you care to pick, it won't matter. If you start trying to scale it across an organization from one department to another, one business unit another, and so on, the adoption will be very patchy. That some of it will be good, some of it will not be so good, and it will depend a lot on the leadership. That the human beings are going to resist. Therefore, and while I was writing the Agile Management book at the time, I had the epiphany that we should not be trying to install frameworks, methods, that scale that will always fail. That what we need is an approach that enables an organization to evolve to a better level of performance, or start with what you do now and evolve. And therefore we need this evolutionary approach. And the management practices in the Kanban method, the make policies explicit, basically define the rules of the system, the implement feedback loops so that you've got some way of evolving and improve in an evolutionary way and evolve experimentally. We've got a problem. Let's suggest a solution to it. Let's try that solution and then let's use our feedback loop to see whether it worked or not. If it's working, do more of it. If it's not working, back it out, change to something else. So the Kanban method is primarily a management method for installing the evolutionary DNA in your organization. And the operational practices of just making sure that things flow functionally, that's the foundation that, how do I put this very simply? If you're an entrepreneur and you want to open, say, a pizza restaurant, fundamentally you need to know how to bake pizza. And then you start worrying about who are our customers, what flavors of pizza do they like, what times of day do we need to be open. Maybe at lunchtime they just want a slice, but in the evening they want the whole pie to share out with friends. So you need to be able to do the basics. You need to be able to build whatever it is, the thing that you do for a living, do it with predictability and quality, and then you start worrying about how to improve everything else around it. So the issue that we've seen with Agile frameworks, I predicted it back in 2002, that because the human condition is the way it is, you take some prescriptive, defined methodology or framework and try to scale it in an organization, people are going to resist. And unless you have an explicit approach to dealing with that resistance, then you won't succeed. And my feeling was that you could take the sort of authoritarian dictatorship sort of view of anyone who resists will be thrown in the gulag. And some change management methods, defined stuff that people learn, actually suggest that.
Well, it really depends. It really depends on the context, right? So if you have a company that has like a half year on a cash flow basis to live, you might want to start a revolution in order to prevent going bankrupt, right? But if you're doing somewhat good, you'd be way better with an evolutionary approach.
Well, it depends. So if say you've got 6 months of cash left and you can see it's burning away because you're cash flow negative, then the issue is, do we double down on sales and sell more of what we've got? The question for that is our product fundamentally sound? Is it just a case of getting people to realize they should be buying it? Or do we have to pivot in some way? And if you are going to pivot, recognize that that's a J-curve. And if we're going to run out of money in 6 months, can we come out the other side of that J-curve cash flow positive? Is the pivot going to work fast enough? And the questions like, say we have to maybe repackage an existing product. It's a marketing activity. So that has a lead time. We have to do the repackaging. We need to send out the marketing messages. People need to hear it, and then they might start buying. Versus we've got existing products, just sell more of them. Find out how to sell more of them. Maybe it's special offers, discounts, bundles. Maybe it is a little bit of deeper empathy with the customer and understanding the right message that will switch them on. But if you're in really a hurry, it's a sales job. If you've got more time, it's a marketing job. If you've got even more time, it's a strategic planning job, and you can think about pivoting.
Yeah, I think that we talked about frameworks, and I think that it would be so much easier if you, instead of like teaching practices and teaching management practices and all those things, instead like give them a process and roles and responsibility, like a Scrum guide would give you. Like, it is way easier for people to adopt that style. So
without doubt, people want you to just tell them what to do, right?
Yeah,
or at least
yeah.
in many cultures, just tell me what to do. And therefore, the guidance needs to be pragmatic and actionable, not just tell you what to do, but it needs to be something you're capable of implementing. Yes, I agree with that. The challenge is, are people abdicating responsibility as a consequence? Are they saying, just tell me what to do, so that they're not taking responsibility for the job they're actually being paid for? And when it doesn't work, they can blame the framework, blame the consultants, blame somebody else on the outside. And
make a meme of SAFE on the internet and post it on LinkedIn to get a few good likes.
yeah. That's sort of therapy type behavior, right? And we see a lot of that, a lot of playing the victim and just seeking therapy for the fact that things are not going very well. Now, the Kanban method and the whole concept of its management training, whether it's an individual who's empowered to manage the work, or whether it's some more senior person who's got some responsibility for a system of work, it requires that people take responsibility and that at least some of them are held accountable for the outcomes. So the market for Kanban at a more mature level has always been people who take responsibility and are being held accountable for outcomes. I think the Agile market has suffered a lot from a lack of that. People not taking responsibility, no accountability for outcomes, but there's plenty of theatre. We're performing the events, we're playing the roles.
It's just way easier and convenient to like follow the plan and then blame the plan, and it's really hard to like try to adopt those principles and management practices into your own context, whatever that is. So there are a lot of misconceptions about Kanban out there. So I tried to collect a few of them, and I'd like to do a little game with you where I'm going to present you one of the misconceptions that I got from one of my clients. I don't gonna name no names, but if you're listening to this, well, you made it into the episode. Congratulations. And you react on them and just give me your take, like your thoughts on that. So those are
Very
quotes
good,
that I heard from clients. So the first one is a question that I get asked a lot. It's should we do Scrum or Kanban? What is better?
So I understand why people want to make a choice about which framework should we install. But if someone asked me that question, I'd redirect them to, what outcome are you looking for? What problem are you trying to solve? What is it you're afraid of? And let's focus on that, right? Let's get away from which agile method should we pick, and let's focus on the problem. And then when we do that, then hopefully we back up to a point where they realize that Kanban can help them. Now, there might be some situations where Scrum's the perfect fit for what they're doing, and therefore, okay, go ahead and adopt that. That's fine. But anything that relies on coordinated cadences, time boxes, I question whether that's a particularly good fit for the industry that they're working in. And over the years, I've written various versions of an article called The Tyranny of the Ever-Decreasing Time Box, and it turned into a chapter in my new book, Discovering Kanban, where it points out that a tremendous number of industries really don't run like that. So you adopt Scrum, you try to do it at scale, you're trying to force the rest of your business to change. And our colleague in Brazil, Rodrigo Yoshima, he described it as the Procrustean bed. Right, so Procrustes was an innkeeper and a sort of Robin Hood style bandit on the road to Mount Olympus. And when people came to check into his inn, he believed in really great customer service. He wanted people to have the best night's sleep possible. But all the beds in his inn were the same size. So when someone came to check in, he would measure them, and if they were too tall, he would chop off their feet and some of their legs so that they fitted the bed perfectly. And if they were too short, he put them on one of these torture racks and stretched them out to be taller so that they would fit perfectly. And I feel like Scrum at scale does that to an organization, that Scrum is the Procrustean bed and the organization all needs to change to fit Scrum. And Kanban's the opposite way around. We will adopt the Kanban design to fit your organization and help it evolve.
That is a pretty good answer. Let's do the second one. We're doing Scrum. We don't need Kanban. Scrum is also limiting WIP in the planning.
Okay, so you're doing Scrum. You don't need Kanban. You're completely satisfied with the outcomes. Is that true? And they're like, well, actually, no, we're not. Because if they were completely satisfied with the outcome, they wouldn't have invited you, Benjamin, to come and help them. Okay, so Scrum isn't producing the outcomes that you wanted. Are you open to the idea that we try to evolve from where you are now to an improved level of performance that produces the outcomes that you actually want? And now there's your opening to add Kanban into this Scrum world, that we need to define the outcomes, and sometimes we refer to those as the fitness criteria. What would represent an actually fit level of service delivery? We need to put the feedback mechanisms in place. We need probably to define some policy and rules, or at least make them explicit. We need to have some visibility on what's going on. We need the right metrics in place and so on. And yes, you can start with the Scrum thing, but if you do a couple of service delivery reviews or operations reviews, people will probably start telling you that the time boxing, the planning, the estimation, etc., it's not working for them. And then we have the challenge of, is this some sort of belief-based dogma, some sort of religion they're following that they feel they can't break away from, or they'll be excommunicated? Or are they willing to try something else, try an alternative way as an experiment to see if it produces a better result?
The next one is actually from yesterday, and by mentioning it among my colleagues, I got like 3 more examples where we heard quite a similar thing. And it is, I don't want a Kanban consulting for my Scrum teams. I fear that my Scrum teams would go for a Kanban approach, dip all the meetings, and we would lose control. So we're not going to hire that Kanban consultant.
We would lose control is a misdirection, right? what you've got is someone who is, I think, a religious devotee of Scrum. And years ago, I've forgotten his name now, but he was high up in the Scrum community at the time, working at the Scrum Alliance, perhaps. We used to use his blog post in our training. So it's 14, 15 years ago already. He wrote a blog post about, he had the Scrum organization, they had sort of topped out their performance, they'd stagnated, Scrum stall, I've heard it called. And he'd added Kanban into the environment and quadrupled the productivity. So the first part of the article was the sort of problem. There's a little bit in the middle about what we did and then the results. And then the remaining almost half of the article, scroll down the web page, this was all about why we don't like it. So we've quadrupled the productivity of this organization by introducing Kanban, but we really don't like it because we're Scrum people. What you've got is maybe a department manager who wants to be, they have a conflict. They want to be seen to be part of the Scrum community. Maybe they want to seem to be loyal or to be pure religiously, but they probably hang out in local Agile meetup groups, local conferences, maybe they do conference speaking. They don't want to be seen to be disloyal. We've seen some of the same behavior here in Spain. We saw it with some companies in Madrid a few years ago. And the whole thing about we'll lose control is a misdirection. Now, if it was a genuine concern, you can ask them, well, what is it you're afraid of? What control are you going to lose? And then address their specific concerns. So the way that you test, is this a misdirection, is by asking, what is it you're afraid of? What control do you think you're going to lose? Let me show you how Kanban replaces that, fixes it, enhances it, whatever it is. And when you give them a good answer, they'll misdirect again to something else because it's fundamentally about religious belief and dogma and member of a social group. That's the real issue, that they don't want to be disloyal or excommunicated from the social group of followers.
Yeah, got you. So that was exactly what I did. So I asked them the question, what are you afraid of? And the answer was that so they wouldn't attend retrospective and reviews anymore. So they wouldn't learn about like products and get the feedback from the customer. They don't improve collaboration because they don't do retrospectives anymore or regularly anymore. They maybe opt for one retrospective per quarter. And he was afraid that performance would go down based on that. Also,
he
I have to
really
mention
know
that
anything about Kanban. Is the
he didn't. He really didn't. I explained and then we settled, but it was really about like, where do my story points go if teams opt for a Kanban? I'm like, where did story points go when you opted for Scrum? There are no story points in the Scrum guide either. So what are you being afraid
also,
of?
my usual answer to that is, look, we start with what you do now. If you do story points now, then we start with that. We won't take them away unless your organization decides to take them away. And that's the whole point of the feedback mechanisms.
That one sentence you just said, like, start where you are now and we don't take it away. I should print it on a t-shirt because that I have to repeat that like a million times. People are so afraid of change, right? And when you say, oh, we're going to like start with a few Kanban practices, they will go, oh no, this is a whole new thing. I'm like, no. We're just looking at what you're doing right now, doing a proper analysis, making stuff transparent, and then see where things are that we need to fix. And then we'll gather together and fix that, right? And people have this misconception that also with the first question I asked, like, what is better, Scrum versus Kanban? Those are two so different things in my point of view that you shouldn't compare it at all. And it may be a mistake to mention this on a podcast as a question, but I hear this just so many times that people would compare those two things. But yeah, To me, it's like a whole different story. Last question that I'm having here is Kanban only works for repeatable tasks. We do innovative product development. We have chaos. Kanban doesn't work for us. Is that true?
I think there's a sort of snobbery about what we do is so chaotic and untamable. Only we, as great heroes, are capable of doing it. And at the bottom line is the idea that if we could somehow get under control what we do, we wouldn't be heroes anymore. So the issue is a self-image identity issue. And actually, they're not in chaos. Almost certainly not. But we do have several case studies in our published literature and experience reports from conference videos and so on, where there were startup situations where at the very beginning, for a brief period of time, they were essentially in chaos, right? They were maturity level 1 on the maturity level 0 on the maturity model. But in every single case, they realized that if we're going to complete the product and launch it, we need to define some processes. Now, if people are in complete chaos, and again, this shows in some of the case studies, installing Scrum as a way of taming the chaos, and Ken Schwaber's original Scrum website was called controlchaos.com, still exists. Putting some basic rules at a team level around can we get something out the door, we see that in the Posit Science case study that's well documented. It's 4 chapters in the new Discovering Kanban book. It's used in our Kanban system improvement training class. They start in chaos. They realize we need to do something to tame that chaos. They introduce Scrum. A couple of years later, they realize that they've taken Scrum as far as it's going to take them, and they're still not performing at the level they need to be for the future of their business. And that led to the introduction of Kanban there, and the evolution to the point where processes were unrecognizable in comparison to the Scrum guide, if you like, although it didn't exist at that time. But when you asked the development team, they would still tell you, we are Scrum team, we do Scrum here. But it was unrecognizable any longer. And I was always okay with that, because it was never about me or about us, about Kanban getting the credit. Right, it's about producing the right outcome.
Looking a little bit at my list, I'm seeing like I have one more thing that I'd like to add here, because I found it in preparation for this episode. So I dug into the Scaled Agile framework. Have you heard of that?
Well, yes, I've heard of it. It's been around for 12 years or so. Yeah.
So the Scaled Agile framework, short SAFe, also has a take on Kanban. And what it's writing is, Kanban is a lean workflow management tool.
Yeah, I think that, so first of all, I'm not the expert on the Scaled Agile framework. It's gone through a tremendous number of versions, and they've also done a bit of work to obfuscate just how many versions there were. But realistically, it's on version 8 or 9 now. I think officially it's version 6, but it's really version 8 or 9. And therefore, in a 12-year period of time, they've had 8 or 9 different versions of something that is supposed to work. And I find it very strange that the market doesn't notice this, that within the time frame of you asked us to adopt this, the consultants arrived, started helping us adopt it, you've issued a whole new version and it's massively different from the previous version. And now everyone has to be recertified in it. At what point does the customer base call bullshit on this? The Kanban method hasn't even had a version 2. And the KMM, which is a massive thing, has had a couple of community preview releases and a couple of betas, then version 1, 1.1, 1.2, but it's incremental. We haven't trashed a whole bunch of stuff. Well, what the safe people have basically done is whatever happens to be trendy, whatever they hear in the market where customers might want to spend money on something. And it might not be that they're trying to replace safe with the other thing, but if you're the consultants and they're spending money on something else that you don't offer, your revenue goes down. So each iteration of SAFE has taken other people's work and sort of assimilated it and usually changed it massively because they don't want to disrupt maybe the core, I don't know. But they've taken a lot of other people's intellectual property, modified it in ways that it's almost unrecognizable, and it's all thought experiment. You know, some folks sit in an office and say, well, here's a whole bunch of reference literature. How would that look if we integrated it into what we're doing? And then they publish it. So it doesn't fit the core ethos of my business that we offer pragmatic, actionable, evidence-based guidance. We're not selling it to you unless we've tried it already. And they did with Kanban what they've done with everything else they've taken from the outside. So it's a bunch of people who read a few reference documents, cherry-picked bits, glued it in. It's a Frankenstein's monster.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so as well. To me, it was quite interesting to dig into I don't know if you have read the John Deere case study on SAFe, linking to the John Deere case study on Scrum at Scale they published. Those are like within a certain period of time. The SAFe case study, John Deere is like end of 2019, and the Scrum at Scale case study starts at, I think, January or February 2020. So they have
Okay.
this period of they tried SAFe and then they tried Scrum at Scale. And it was really interesting because they tried to adopt SAFe following the implementation snake roadmap or whatever they call it. And they got everyone certified. They got a bunch of SPCs. They got a bunch of trainings. They built up processes, meetings, boards, whatever. And they couldn't quite get the results they wanted. So by the end of 2019, they ditched the whole thing and asked Jeff Sutherland to finally help them to get to become agile. And I was just sitting there eating popcorn, watching this from the side, and waiting to have someone have another try on implementing another framework. And I found it quite interesting that Jeff and his team analyzed John Deere's situation, and then instead of like giving them a framework and roles and responsibilities, they opted for a quite evolutionary approach on implementing their Scrum at Scale techniques
Okay.
they're promoting. And I really appreciated that because that was like finally someone is talking about an evolutionary approach of making a company better. And that case study is really great because it's showing that even if you opt for a certain framework or you have a vision of how that organization should look like, there's still an evolutionary way towards it, and it may
Mm.
lead you to something else, but at least it's rooted in the problems that you need to solve in order to achieve your goals, right? So that those two case studies actually someone should pick them up and put them together in one story to tell like the whole picture of the John
I,
Deere
I suspect
transition.
it's maybe not the first John Deere case study for SAFe because in the very early years, they had 4 case studies, BMC software and a couple of other ones. John Deere was one of them. So it must have been an earlier iteration of a SAFe adoption. And a couple of years later, I had two coaches, internal change agent guys from John Deere in one of my change leadership master classes. And they said, we just don't recognize. Yes, Dean was in the building for a while, but the material that's in that case study, we do not recognize it. So we don't know where it came from. But that was so much earlier, it must be a different case study. Yeah. They've probably had more than one attempt, and perhaps luckily, fortunately, they had a sufficient institutional memory to think, well, should we keep trying to do the same thing and expect a different outcome? If we keep just, Bart Simpson sticking his fingers in the socket, fired across the room off the wall. Are we really insane? And it sounds like the pandemic delivered some sanity and they decided to try something else.
Yeah. Another thing here, because on last episode I talked with Mike Lyons. Do you know him? Have you heard of him?
I've heard of him. I see him on LinkedIn often enough. I don't think I've
Yeah.
ever met him, no.
Yeah, so Mike is giving a lot of trainings on Scrum and agility, and he has like a project management background. So he has a lot of affiliation with PMI and all the project management standards around that. And we made an episode on what is happening to the agile consultancy, agile coach market, right? Because we see a lot of layoffs, like people are letting go Scrum Masters in the thousands, and we wondered, like, what would the future of those frameworks be, or the future of those approaches be? What would an outlook look like? So I wonder, on the Kanban side of things, where do you see Kanban within the next 5 years? Like, what could happen?
Wow. So in some ways, I think that the market is coming to us. That a little earlier in our discussion today, we were talking about a lack of taking responsibility and being held accountable. I feel that ultimately what fueled that was the fact that capital was so cheap and it was so easy to keep borrowing money, vast sums of money for corporations. Last year, one of the consultants in our community, Amanda Varela, she's a Brazilian woman who lives in Australia nowadays, and she did a very successful Kanban implementation in a division of Petrobras, the Brazilian oil company, about 15 years ago now, at a scale of about 400 people, and she was really a leader in our community. Amanda moved to Australia. Last year she was speaking at a conference and she was planning her talk. And the talk was around the theme of why has Kanban been so widely adopted in Brazil and so successful and not so much in Australia or New Zealand. And she had called me up to chat about my thoughts on it. And I said, look, the issue is that Brazilian companies aren't rich enough to be stupid. And even in an era of cheap capital, Brazil had gone through a period of economic difficulty. When I first visited Brazil, their currency was 1.6 to the US dollar, and nowadays it's less than 5. It's more than 5. It's, I think, 6 reals to the euro at the moment. Brazilian companies were in challenging economic times, and this meant that they needed staff who took responsibility and were held accountable for outcomes. And in that environment, we've seen tremendous adoption of Kanban in all sectors, the public sector, banks, finance, industrial companies, media companies, small companies, very large, huge. In terms of Kanban University's business, Brazil is the highest volume market. And in terms of the impact that we've made in an economy, I think that Brazil is probably the greatest also. So the economic conditions have changed for the whole world, and capital's now expensive. Companies need employees who take responsibility, and some of them to be held accountable and to produce results, because they can't just keep going borrowing more money to compensate for a lack of good results. And that should bring the market to us, because we've 20 plus years of producing fantastic results in a very repeatable manner. That we know that our training works, we know it's effective. There was a group at Accenture in Rio de Janeiro who published a cumulative flow diagram from a particular development organization, and they annotated it with when they took Kanban training, TKP, KSD, KSI, and the graph did this. And after they'd completed KSI training, the KMP level credential, and then let that stew for a few more weeks or a couple of months, their productivity increase was 16 times where they started. So we know that what we do actually works, and it works at scale, and it works all over the world in different cultures, in different industries, at different scales of business. And it's fundamentally because we've always had this value of we only teach pragmatic, actionable, evidence-based guidance. And every time we see barriers, when we see some barrier to adoption, I go and look at that carefully and I start to see a pattern of perhaps very similar. And what's causing this? And what gap do we have in our literature, our guidance, our curricula to fill that gap, to bridge over the problem? And we've built a portfolio of training classes that now enables a business like Unicred in Brazil. Unicred's a finance company. Recently, last year's Kanban Brazil, one of the senior business directors was the presenter at the conference. And he presented market data on them versus the competitors in the Brazilian market. Their competitors were all down 30% in 2022, and their revenues were up 70%. And he attributed that ability to get more revenue directly to the agility that had been enabled through their Kanban initiative. A Kanban initiative with 2,200 people, with one accredited Kanban consultant, 3 Kanban coaching professionals, and a management team trained at the KMP, the Kanban management professional level. Only those 4 people were from the outside, the AKC, the 3 KCPs. So at a negligible cost of almost nothing, 4 extra headcount in a 2,200 person organization, they had taken the revenue up by 70% against a market that was falling by 30%. And we know that that's repeatable because these guys were following the playbook. They were following the Kanban maturity model playbook. They were following the training program that they'd come through with us. The cost to them of creating this incredibly agile business is negligible. It's a rounding error. And that's the power of Kanban done properly. And there's no reason that companies all over the Northern Hemisphere shouldn't be able to do that too, providing they have a workforce that take responsibility, will be held accountable for outcomes. And in a world of expensive capital, I think that's going to happen more and more and more.
I think this is a beautiful case, and I'm really hoping to see more of those case studies popping up and stories that we could tell about really implementing those practices instead of having brain farts about like book contents that never really were rooted in any sort of case study or company situation. If people want to learn more about those cases, about your content, where do people find you?
Everything that we've published is on Kanban Plus, kanban.plus. Some of it, of course, you need to start the paid subscription. There is free content, but you have to register as a subscriber, and everything's accumulated there. Of course, many other things we published are scattered on various websites, but everything of real value is available through the Kanban Plus website, kanban.plus, and I really encourage you to get an account there, and perhaps we even have a discount code for people listening to the... So what is that, Benjamin?
Oh, yeah. So by now, we're almost at the end of the episode. So you could open up the show notes within your podcast player and you see a variety of links. There's also a discount code for Kanban Plus, which gives you a 2-week subscription, and also for David's training. So make sure to click on that link and use the discount code STELLAR on trainings and Kanban Plus subscriptions. Yeah. And that marks the end of today's episode. Thank you so much for joining in, David.
Thank you for having me, Benjamin. It's great to talk with you. It's been a while.
I think we did like the longest episode on this podcast ever. We're 1 hour and almost 20 minutes deep. So I really appreciate you.
I'm sure you'll edit it into a couple of episodes.
I will. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Yeah, and you. And enjoy your weekend. Cheers,
Thank you.
Benjamin.
Bye. Thank you so much for listening to the very end of today's episode. It's a good time to take a look at our show notes and get 20% off at David's content. Or give the Stellar Work website a visit. If you need help with your agile transformation and you think an evolutionary approach might be the right thing, don't hesitate to write us an email. Evaluating and planning your agile transformation is a quick and easy task, which we will be more than happy to just give away like so. No contracts needed. Try it and send us an email at info@stellarwork.com or open up the show notes and take the email address from there. That's it for this week. See you on LinkedIn, Space Cowboys. Bye bye.
On the show, the punch is up to play from Scotland's coast. He's here to pave the way, control systems in his mind. From Glasgow's heart, igniting what the funding cuts. A fresh start, chaos to control, Kanban in our veins. Agile evolution, breaking all the chains from the darkness to the dawn. Workflows in our hands, David leads the way with Corbis who commands. Games in the 80s, coding through the night. Manager at a startup, finding ways to fight. No internet like now, just regional and small. But David had the vision to see beyond the wall. Chaos to control, Kanban in our veins. Agile evolution, breaking all the chains from the darkness to the dawn. Workflows in our hands, David leads the way with Corbis who commands. Games in the 80s, coding through the night. Manager at a startup, finding ways to fight. No internet like now, just regional and small. But David had the vision to see beyond the wall. Chaos to control, Kanban in our veins. Agile evolution, breaking all the chains from the darkness to the dawn. Workflows in our hands, David leads the way with Corbis who commands. IBM to Singapore, his skills in high demand. With Peter Code and Natural, took a noble stand. From BIOS code to forums, connections made with care. A common revolution, spreading everywhere. Sprint to Motorola, struggles in the night. Introducing methods, shining in the light. Resisting the resistance, finding ways to teach. Kanban's in the system, within everyone's reach. Chaos to control, Kanban in our veins. Agile evolution, breaking all the chains from the darkness to the dawn. Workflows in our hands, David leads the way with Corbis who commands.